Good morning. Thank you to everyone joining us virtually and those who are here in person. It's a pleasure to be joined by two people who have written what is shaping up to be really the book of the year when it comes to foreign policy, and I think no doubt some of the most leading work when it comes to economic security issues. Joining me today is Federico Steinberg, a CSIS colleague from the Europe program. My name is Emily Benson. I'm with the Project on Trade and Technology here at CSIS. It is a serious pleasure to be joined by Abe Newman and Henry Farrell, the authors of this new book, Underground Empire: How America Weaponized the World Economy. I will spare you their lengthy and very impressive bios, only to say that they've been widely published recently, having written an op-ed in the New York Times, I think 2 weeks ago, and more recently a piece in Foreign Affairs, which I encourage you to read. We will begin today with a short overview. I'll turn to the authors to provide a short takeaway on what your book is about and why this topic is so important today.
Well, it's a very important topic because, as I think most of us know, the world has really changed drastically over the last several years in ways which make us question globalization and how it is that globalization works. So I think that is the first big message that our book has, that we thought that globalization was going to create a much more decentralized world, what Thomas Friedman called a flat world in which businesses in Jakarta, in Dublin, in Dubai, in Illinois would be able to compete on a level playing field. And instead, our argument is that the world actually turned out to be post-globalization, a world which was in many ways much more centralized. The economic and financial and information networks on which the world depends turned out to be highly centralized, and turned out to be highly centralized in ways that were vulnerable particularly to the influence of the United States, as after September 11th, it rapidly began to start thinking about how to protect its security against all of these unexpected threats. So that, I think, is the first lesson that we have. The second is how the United States and its efforts to protect its security unfolded. And really our argument is here that this was not some kind of grand master plot. Instead, it's officials trying to deal with crisis after crisis, emergency after emergency, using whatever tools they have to hand, adapting them, making them bigger and more powerful, and discovering, and I think this is where we are at the moment, discovering that they've created a vast machinery which is much bigger and much more powerful than anybody realized. And then, of course, the final part of our book is how it is that the United States is not the only country and it's not the only actor that is thinking about what it has to do in this world. And we describe how US allies such as the European Union are reacting. We describe how China, which of course is in an increasingly adversarial relationship with the US, is reacting. And we also talk about how businesses are reacting and how they ought to react as well.
And maybe just to make a final point is that, as Henry said, because this really, I think, was an accidental empire, our major concern is that these new weapons, these tools that the US and now other actors are using, that they could really spiral out of control. And then, whether it's the global economy or your heating that you might have in the winter, these things get put at risk. And if we don't start thinking more strategically and globally about how to manage this, we could put, some of the greatest, the things that have brought us so much benefit over the last decades, globalization, at risk.
So one thing that strikes me in the book is your use of warfare terminology in the application of economics and international trade relations and, of course, broader technology. So you have this amazing quotation, if I could just read it here. When you have built the economic equivalent of a nuclear arsenal, you shouldn't be surprised when others think about striking first or striking back. And I think that's a very good encapsulation of some of the more the deeper philosophical issues at hand that you raise in your book. Another element that you address is that you seem to argue that the United States is not really a superpower state anymore, but a state with superpowers. And I'm wondering if one of you could unpack that a little bit for us.
Do you want to go on the state with superpowers, and I'll go on the...
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, I think we really like the superhero metaphor. I grew up reading a lot of comics as a child, and I think the story of the book, the arc, is this kind of, there's an origin story, this discovery after 9/11 of that there were these networks, these maps of how to control or use the global economy as a weapon. And then it created this power that was beyond just the traditional economic powers. Like the United States has used economic statecraft for decades. But the difference really here is by leveraging these private companies, these networks that go beyond the US really market itself, that it can reach and have a power that few had ever anticipated. And so I think when we're thinking about the superhero structure narrative, it's also, in a lot of those stories, it's about can you control these powers? Can you use them for good? And do you become overwhelmed by the hubris of what these powers can do? And that's kind of, I think, the final point is just to say, we want to make sure that the United States is using them in a responsible way. There's that Spider-Man quote, with great power comes with great responsibility. And I think that's really the, one of our main points is to give that warning of to say, well, we need to make sure we're doing that.
And just to come in on what you said at the beginning about the way in which we think about this, and we use a lot of metaphors from warfare. Well, in some ways, we could turn to another piece of popular culture, and both Abe and I are dads, so this is the classic dad movie of all time, which is Master and Commander. And you could have a sort of black slide with October 2023, markets are now battlefields, which is, I think, a big part of our story, so that now we have these areas of activity which we used to think about in purely economic terms, which now we are thinking more and more in terms of strategic dominance of one sort or another. But as Abe said, there is also an important trap there. And that's what we try to get across in the piece we have in the New Foreign Affairs, where what we argue effectively is that one of the dangers we face is that as the United States begins to think about economic security, that it will really overemphasize the security part of this over the economic, and that it will turn too much to the vast machineries that it has created to think about national security issues and not think about how the economy itself has its own logic and what kinds of things you want to do in order to be able to preserve some degree of multilateralism, some degree of trade. And so we think that the Biden administration, in its language of de-risking, moving away from this notion of decoupling, that this is a very, very positive move. It's a positive sign. But if you really want to deliver on de-risking, it's going to be a huge, huge challenge. And we think that people have only begun to grapple with the enormity of this challenge that they are going to face if you want to do de-risking seriously. That involves sort of not just overemphasizing security, but thinking about the economy in a whole new way, having access to new kinds of data, new kinds of policy instruments. So we're perhaps at the beginning of a major phase of transformation, how we think about the role of government.
Maybe before we turn to the economist in the room, who I'm sure has plenty of questions, I'm wondering if we could back up a step and you could provide a couple of very concrete details that you discuss in your book about the strategic dominance the U.S. exercises over these networks. What's really going on? How is the United States essentially weaponizing the internet for its own foreign policy objectives? And I think you have some very colorful, kind of visceral images that are about 3/4 of the way through the book.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the title, Underground Empire, is really trying to get people's attention on all of these technical and arcane parts of the international economy that I think are largely taken for granted. They're just supposed to do the business, get things done. But the aha moment was that when Henry and we were writing actually a different book. It was about privacy fights between the US and Europe. And there was a big fight about SWIFT, the SWIFT system, which is in Belgium. And it's basically like a secure post office for banks where they send messages back and forth. And everyone's like, oh, this is so efficient. We're all routing through this central thing. It's so great. And that's the kind of the traditional economics vision of a focal point or Henry and I were like, well, but that's about power. If you can control a central place in the international economy, then you can learn things and you can also cut people out of that. And it's not just SWIFT. In the book we talk about this place called Ashburn, Virginia, which is very close to the Dulles Airport. And if you go there, you'll just see rows and rows of these kind of one-story flat buildings without windows. And it's, the endless stream of data servers that power the internet. And we think of the internet as a very decentralized thing that's, you could never regulate. But really, that location houses so much of the back end of what happens in the information infrastructure. And you can do the same thing about production networks. It's like we think they're very distributed, but they're actually, and I think that the book, we try to give kind of the flavor for things like Swift or the Amazon Web Services areas to give people something to anchor, to say, this isn't actually in the cloud or, virtual. It's actually often very physical, and that those physical structures allow for government control.
If I can push you a bit on that, it seems like this infrastructure is clearly dominated by the US. So are other players, I'm thinking about China, but also others, capable of replicating some of this? And on the other hand, where the European Union stands, which is a close ally, but a little bit concerned about dependency on some of these issues. Is there more cooperation there, less? Is there fragmentation? If you could speak about these topics as well.
So those are great questions. So I think that if we think about this in terms of the ability of actors to do what the United States has done, I think that's going to be really, really difficult. I think that's going to be really hard, because once you pay attention to these things, once you begin to think about them in terms of strategy, that logic becomes an overwhelming logic. So I think, in a sense, the world that we have was the product of a set of assumptions that we were going to be living in a world of globalization, that we're going to be living in a world where war between major states was a solved problem. And once that is no longer an assumption, it becomes really, really difficult to get other countries to sign on to big systems which have strategic consequences. So I think one of the things that we don't talk about in the book, but that is an interesting counterexample, is GPS satellites. And so if you think about GPS, this really begins to become something around the time that the internet is burgeoning. But because GPS is so directly linked to the US military and US military control, Europe, of course, spends billions of euros trying to create its own competing Galileo system. China creates its own. India is trying to create its own. I think Turkey may be doing stuff. So you, in a sense, you see this world of fragmented networks rather than of networks, which allow for this kind of dominance. And I think it presents some really interesting challenges for the European Union. So Abe has written an earlier book, which I think was one of the bases of arguments that came out later about the Brussels effect, looking at the EU's ability to push privacy regulation on other countries around the world. And the European Union has an exquisitely crafted bureaucratic machinery for patiently and carefully pushing the rules of the global market system in ways that advantage the EU at the expense sometimes of its competitors, and it is extremely well adapted to live in this world of globalization. I think it is finding itself in a very different world, and sort of where we, and it is finding that it is trying desperately, I think, to try to recreate some of its institutions, some of its ways of doing things, the famous four freedoms that its approach is based on. It is trying to adapt those to a world in which those four freedoms cannot be taken for granted as a universal desire, and in which it has to protect itself. So it's very interesting seeing how the European Commission has turned some of its trade instruments more or less deliberately to protecting the EU against various forms of outside coercion. That is not something that if I went into DG Trade 10 years ago, I would be hearing from people in the corridors. That is not something that I frankly ever expected to hear from people in DG Trade in my lifetime. Of course, there is a lot of other discussion going on. Abe and I were tickled a little to hear Joseph Borrell, when he was speaking at the EUI, the European University Institute last year, using our words weaponized interdependence, which is a term that we coined in order to describe the situation that the EU is in. So we see a lot of push on we see a lot of push on foreign policy. We see efforts to try and expand the EU's ambit in national security, which is of course an area that the member states really dominate in. But all of these they are extremely difficult changes to bring through, and they are especially difficult changes to bring through when there is division among the member states and when there is unhappiness among the member states with the notion that the EU might begin to take over decision-making powers which sort of might have consequences for national governments. So I think that the EU perhaps is the power that is most particularly challenged of the three, quote, great powers that we tend to, for better or worse, to emphasize in the book, because the EU is the one whose influence and power has been most linked to traditional markets and traditional market structures, and trying to adapt itself, I think, is going to be an enormous and very interesting challenge for people like Abe and I, who have been studying the EU for decades.
No, it's clear that weaponization of interdependence has been very, very critical for the EU, for energy and other aspects. And in particular, the European Union has kind of, it has woken up to the fact that this dream of interdependence will bring prosperity, cooperation, and even that countries like Russia or China will become more like-minded with Europe and the US. Basically, this is not going to happen. But the question is the EU, which requires, as you said, institutional changes, very far behind, you would say, because of this idea of separating security from economics? And if you could compare that to the discussion or the conversation in China and in the US or even Japan, where do they stand?
Well, I think that, there's kind of a glass half full, half empty story for a lot of the different, competitors to the United States. So, in many cases, it's a question of, do they have the private actor networks that could create an alternative to the hubs that the United States is leading right now? And that's where, you have to break it down more by sectors. So it's not just one story that, like everybody has a challenger or not. But in many of the other regions, there are internal domestic fissures that have nothing to do with weaponized interdependence or the underground empire. It's just they have domestic fights that prevent them from really having these global private actor networks. So like in the United States, you have things, whether it's the sovereign debt crisis or Brexit, those weren't about challenging the United States' JP Morgan. Those were, internal fights that led up to a very fragmented internal financial system that makes it very, it's like, is the euro going to replace the dollar? That's ridiculous. That's not on the table. But that being said, it doesn't mean that these other jurisdictions, that they couldn't change how the underground empire works or how the global economy works. And there, I think what Henry and I see or are most concerned about are like dark spaces that are being created where it's not replacing the dollar. That doesn't need to be happen, but it's what can happen is that there can be an alternative channels for payment where the U.S. is less able to see what's going on, and U.S. Financial institutions are less directly involved. So Secretary Yellen, she gave a speech about the Russia sanctions recently where she said, Russia's selling oil and it's increasing the cost through which they're doing business. And it's a different calculus. It's not like we're going to shut them down, but we're going to increase transaction costs for them. And you saw that that's the same thing that happened to Iran. Iran's under all these sanctions. They create shell companies, these alternative payment systems. It's not replacing the US dollar, but it is creating places in the international system where, I think U.S. policymakers should be concerned because more illicit activity can be done once these kind of test cases happen. And then it creates spaces that, yes, it creates more transaction costs for the target, but it also creates these areas that are kind of out of control.
And if I could just add very quickly, so I think one area, so we talk about this in the foreign affairs piece, that the EU actually has an economic security strategy, which the United States does not. It is weaker on areas, obviously, where military security verge into economic security because it doesn't have the kinds of institutions that would allow those questions to be considered. But I think one area of exceptional weakness that we don't talk about is enforcement. So I'm originally from Ireland, and the Irish Times had a piece a couple of days ago where there was a Irish official who was speaking perhaps a little bit too frankly about and Ireland is supposed to be one of the more sophisticated jurisdictions when it comes to this stuff, and she was saying we can't deliver on sanctions. So we know that there is a lot of activity happening in the Irish financial sector, that there are oligarchs moving money through in ways that are problematic, are suspicious. We do not have the powers, we do not have the capacities, we do not have the capabilities. And I think that this is a general problem that the EU has when it comes to many of these areas. They're left to the member states. The member states, there are dramatic differences in their ability to actually do this stuff. And as Abe says, there's also a lot of fragmentation between the member states as well, which means that problems very often fall into the cracks between one jurisdiction and another. So I think that if the EU really wants to get its act together in this stuff, it is going to have to build up this capacity very, very quickly.
Coming to the US and these institutional issues, you've been arguing that there's a clear need for an economic security committee or council to be created. But how would that be different from the National Economic Council or the National Security Council? What do we need exactly to have in place for this to be more operational?
Yeah, I mean, so I think what Henry and I are really interested in is that there is some way to coordinate issues that are really linking the economic things that the Economic Council is working on and the security issues that the National Security Council is working on, and that tries to prioritize what we think are the economic security issues, which are to say things that could even either create a shock to the local economy, the U.S. economy, or could be used for coercion to influence U.S. decision-making. And our concern is that the national security lens often brings a national security objective, which is to say that there's going to be a survival or war or some kind of overarching existential threat, where the National Economic Council is often just thinking about growth and delivering on the economic objectives. And so, I think the European Union has actually done quite a good job of saying there's this other set of issues that we need to map what they are. We need to think about what the agenda is for them and then create an institutional structure that could create risk management for these types of problems. And at least in our, we don't want to have a new Department of Homeland Security mess that's, a monstrosity in the US government. It's really, we're just thinking about as could there be a coordination set of institutions that maybe liaises between those two existing. Maybe it's double hatting people within them to think about these issues. We're not lawyers where we have like the legal structure for these issues, but I think we want to flag that neither body is really thinking about these issues in an economic security lens, and that could really lead the U.S. government astray when it comes to these types of crises.
And that's something, it builds on conversations we've had with national security officials who have suggested to us that one of the big problems they face is that they do not have the legal authorities to take measures for economic security as opposed to traditional national security. And that means that very often they find themselves in an awkward situation. The other thing I would say is that we are, so this piece I think is one of the, that we wrote for Foreign Affairs where we talk about this. Obviously, if you write in Foreign Affairs, it gets a lot of attention. But I think that we are just two people among a number of people who are singing from a roughly similar hymn sheet on this set of issues. So you can see, for example, Dalip Singh had a piece in Bloomberg, he was interviewed by Dan Flatley, which makes arguments about economic statecraft that are very similar to the ones that we're making. And I know that there are other people in other places like CSIS around town who are talking and thinking about similar types of questions. So I expect we're going to see a flurry of very specific suggestions for how we handle this. And I think Abe and I, as Abe said, our fundamental objective here is A, that this stuff ought to be considered, B, it should not become some kind of huge bureaucratic behemoth which begins to inflict its own pathologies upon the world.
So I've heard something very interesting recently from a G7 partner, and what they were saying is that the United States in some ways doesn't really need an economic security strategy in the way that allies do, because the United States has such tremendous market power that it can push back against Chinese economic coercive behavior and be very open and upfront about the goals. Whereas other countries, whether it's, let's say, the Netherlands recently, or Japan, or the Republic of Korea, they cannot withstand the same amount of retaliation from China. Therefore, they have to couch some of these policies in a broader economic security agenda that looks and feels like more of a policy retool. And I thought that was sort of an interesting observation about the US toolkit. And I probably am in the camp where we do need an economic security strategy. I don't know how feasible that would be, but that was an interesting nugget that I've been thinking about. But either way, that brings up this tough question of Chinese retaliation. And it seems like we're all contending with the broader the economic security net becomes, the more we will have to contend with over time. Just last week, China announced a new tranche of export restrictions on graphite, which is something that goes into battery production. It hits right at the heart of this allied attempt to decarbonize our economy. You also have this great quotation in the book that says that the Huawei response to a lot of these US measures is really like a guerrilla-style campaign where it's trying to attack the US policy from various angles in China. So I'm wondering if you could say a couple of words about retaliation, about what we're seeing from China. We also saw this 7-nanometer chip news come out of Huawei during Secretary of Commerce Raimondo's visit in August. So will they prevail? Will this guerrilla-style campaign defeat the underground empire?
So I would just like to start with the overarching question was, does the United States need an economic security agenda? Because I think for exactly these reasons, where it might not be about that we need new tools. You know, the EU needs to create a rethink, like how could they respond? But for us, we have the tools, but we need to basically do a better job of saying what are the threats, you know, what are the dangerous areas of globalization or with the Chinese relationship, and what are the areas that are much more benign and where, you know, trade and commerce should just keep going. And if you don't do that, if you don't clearly have this kind of a strategic agenda, then it's easy to blur those things that are not a threat into the threat area. And then pretty soon everything devolves and you have this cascade of tit for tat interactions like you were describing. And so I think what Henry and I kind of try to stress in the book is that often what seemed like the ceiling in the use of these weapons quickly becomes a floor and there's a new ceiling, and that keeps escalating. And I think if you don't have a more strategic doctrine around it, that you're likely to get that. In the U.S.-China interaction, I think, you know, it's so fascinating, and we could write like a whole nother book just about that. I just maybe I'll just take a few kind of things I've been thinking about. I think Henry and I have been thinking about it together. One of them is, if the U.S., you know, we often look to China when we think about like, will the U.S. prevail in these interactions? But I think we also have to look inside the United States and think about, you know, are we using these tools as effectively as we could? And I think that the 7-nanometer chip and the export controls, like, it's a great example of, at least from my understanding, of where the bureaucratic implementation of the original export controls, it allowed for the continued sale of a lot of the things, in some part because industry is involved in writing the, you know, fine details of these rules. And so the latest export controls that just came out a few weeks ago are really slapping industry on the wrist and saying, hey, we meant this, you know. And so is it really about Chinese innovation and they've, you know, or is it that the domestic politics around export controls, we're just understanding that, you know, it's like we're just figuring out how do we do that. And so as this interaction unfolds, there'll be a temptation just to look at China and what China's doing, but we also really have to think about what we're doing and how these things are interrelated.
So I'll just, on the second, so I think that there are two major areas where you can think about US-China contention. One is the financial sector, and it's clear that China was startled at some of the things that happened to Russian bank reserves in the wake of the invasion, and the other is technology. And so when it comes to finance, I think it's plausible that China can do, and certainly will do, everything it can to try to insulate itself from the kinds of actions that the US and the EU took. But it is also very difficult for it to insulate itself completely while still remaining a part of the global economy. You know, you You can make it harder to get at your stuff, but if you want to maintain and increase your role in sort of the global economy, and China clearly wants to do this, you are going to expose yourself to some extent to the ability of the existing powers to retaliate against you. So that I think, and I think that China, it seems to me extremely unlikely that China could ever create something that really resembled the dollar clearing system. It's very, very hard, given China's unwillingness to make its own currency completely convertible, for other countries to rely on that more than they really rely on that as being a central element. And furthermore, I think that it's also very hard for authoritarian systems to really persuade other countries and other businesses to trust them completely with their assets over the long run. And the converse of this is that the more that the United States becomes like China, that is willing to work around the rule of law when the rule of law is temporarily inconvenient, the more that happens, the less the US long-term advantage over China is going to be. So I think one of the things that really we would love to see US policymakers realize is that the fact that the United States is in some ways constrained is actually incredibly valuable. This is not something, it is inconvenient in the short term for sure in a huge variety of ways. It is an enormous long-term advantage that the United States should not give up. When it comes to technology, it's really, really difficult to say, because technology is, innovation is by definition, effectively, it is an inherently unpredictable process. And it is really, really hard for I think for the US to make bets, which are really long-term bets on, if we do X with what NVIDIA is producing, we are going to have these long-term consequences for China's ability to innovate when it comes to military AI. The best that the US can do is make bets and hope that it is right. It needs much, much more capacity than it has to figure out which are the best bets to make. But these are inherently going to be bets that are made in a situation of uncertainty. So it is possible then that the guerrilla campaign might work. It's possible that China might find some way around the kinds of controls that are being placed upon it. It may find alternative ways of organizing its economy. It may find ways to retaliate. These are all these are all very plausible. I think that it is going to be, however, extremely difficult for China, at least in the short to medium term, to really get itself out of the vise that it is in, provided that the United States continues to behave in a proactive way in seeking to restrict these technologies. I think that if you look at the ability to get access to the latest semiconductors, it really is going to be extremely hard for China to recreate that in any straightforward way. And people like Dan Wang, who I think is, for me, the person who is I find the most useful in his insights on the Chinese technological innovation system. If you're trying to build up a semiconductor industry, this is literally not like rocket science. Rocket science you can do in a kind of hierarchical way. Semiconductor innovation, you've got to create an ecology, and it is really, really hard for an authoritarian government to build the kind of ecology that it would need to build. So long term, who the hell knows? Short to medium term, I think that the United States is probably going to continue to get its dominance, but I am far, far happier being an academic opinionating on this from outside than the person who has to make the hard decisions in the US government about which way to jump.
No, but on that, it's clear that US financial power has been around for a while, and you clearly document this, but moving to the more academic areas or spheres of power, could we perhaps argue that the US is really creating a new dimension of international power through export controls and technology that was not there before with these elements, or is it too early to say?
I mean, I think that what we think is very new is the creation of a system of control that is using intellectual property to externalize U.S. power. So export controls aren't new. The U.S. has used them for a long time, and in the Cold War, they used them brutally against the Soviet Union and basically created two systems that were independent from each other, not interdependent with each other. And so the question now is, can they be used more as a scalpel rather than just shutting things off. And that's what you see in the foreign direct product rule and these different ways of thinking, okay, how can we target much more limited areas, the whole small yard, high fence strategy. And so I think we do think that is, innovative in terms of a system of control that is based around the global structure of production that developed after the 1980s, and that it's an experiment that we know much less about when we compare it to sanctions and to extraterritorial financial control. And so it's something that I think needs to be studied, and we need to be careful about how we use it.
The way I've been thinking about this is that if you look at the control of the financial system, this is, as Abe said at the beginning, this is really about focal points. That is that you have a lot of people, macroeconomists, microeconomists, who broadly agree that you're going to get convergence upon a common set of standards or a common approach, and this is going to involve some centralization, and the United States can take advantage of this centralization, the fact that everybody has converged on the dollar. Sooner or later, there will be a move to a different currency, but people have been predicting the doom of the dollar for a long, long time, and it ain't happened yet. But trying to control financial flows is one thing. Trying to control innovation is a very different thing. So I think that certainly the United States is sort of creating new and entirely unexpected instruments to do this. But it also is a much, much more difficult set of problems to solve, in that innovation by its very nature is going to be an inherently unruly process, and a process where it is very difficult to predict. So certainly the US is doing what it can do to try and control the way in which innovation works in the future. But equally, so there are inevitably going to be surprises. These might be on the upside, these surprises, they might be on the downside. It is going to be very, very hard to predict.
So one thing that struck me in your book is this idea that a lot of the tools that the administration is using today aren't necessarily new. And I think that's a misunderstanding about the October 7th, 2022 export controls, and the latest update is this is some seismic shift. At the end of the day, it does fit into this policy arc that you outline in your book. Concurrently, however, it seems like we're at this new juncture where economic security is overtaking traditional trade, where the United States is sort of hollowing out the WTO and looking for alternative institutions. So how do you square the circle on this is really a traditional toolkit, but we're in new circumstances?
I mean, I think we root a lot of what is going on into the transformation that happened after 9/11 and the attacks, the terrorist attacks on the U.S. In that, I think that we've failed to really fully grapple how transformative that moment was, because it was not planned in terms of the U.S. response, but in addition to all of the ground wars, which has gotten a lot of the attention of the forever wars, there was a transformation of how people thought about the relationships between economic and security interests. And so you got responses in the NSA, in Treasury, in a whole range of agencies where they saw that these global networks really had alternative, or could be put to alternative purposes. And we're seeing in the Biden administration's use or the Trump administration's use of these tools is really the experiments that happened after 9/11 growing and being used for other domains. So first it was terrorism, then it was non-proliferation, then it gets used against Russia. It's like an expanding set of objectives that these tools are also being put to task. I think that that is going on at the same time that you're seeing kind of I'm going to say the old neoliberal strategy hits a wall. And that's not just about the United States. It's like the European Union, the Doha round, everybody's like, there's just, you can't squeeze any more juice out of that system. And so the fact that you have, at the one hand, the development of these economic security weapons, at the same time that the traditional kind of story about globalization is running its course. COVID, and what we learned from COVID, it has nothing to do with those economic weapons, but we see the choke points, you can't get your toilet paper, all that kind of stuff happening, and people are like, oh, that system that we thought was just about benefits and wealth and prosperity also creates vulnerability. And the problem is when it's not just stochastic, when it's not just some random act that creates that, but when governments are doing it, intentionally, that becomes then, I think, a shock through the system.
And following up on this, do you think that there's any role for multilateral institutions, especially the WTO, if it is reformed somehow, to try to coordinate some of these elements to avoid frictions and conflicts? Or because really multilateralism does not appear in the book or in the conversation as it used to be. There's a change in ideas, in hegemonic ideas throughout the world. So is there a role, you think, for some minimum coordination or reform of the WTO on some of these issues?
It's really hard to say, and we don't say this because in a sense we're still in the early stages of the story. That is that if you are going to see coordination, you need to have some kind of a rough consensus among the major actors, including the actors we don't talk about in the book. So we have very, very little about the Global South in the book, which I think is one of the but we can't cover everything, and so we covered the areas that we know most about. You need some kind of minimal set of agreement on what the principles ought to be, so that then you can spend decades of painful negotiations to figure out how it is actually going to work in practice. So we would hope, I think, that there is a scope for genuine multilateral agreement on this. How that is going to work is really it's going to be very, very hard, because the other transformation that we see is that, as Emily said, we are in a world where export controls have been around for many decades. But when they were initially designed, they were designed for a world in which there was a hard cutoff between the countries that you're allies with, where you effectively had trade, albeit with a lot more control via export controls than people, I think, remember. And then you had governments such as the Soviet Union and those which were directly under its influence, where trade was minimized very deliberately. So now we're in a very different world, which is where you're trying to do the two at once. That is, you're trying to have controls in a world in which there is still a lot of trade, including trade with between countries which are increasingly becoming adversaries. And so trying to work out even the practices of how to do this well, let alone the principles, is going to be very, very hard. And it is going to involve a lot of difficult thinking about what exactly are the areas where security risks are paramount, and what are the areas where they are not paramount. And it is, again, very difficult to figure this out ex ante. We are now in a world where graphics chips, which 10 years ago were used for ray tracing and whatever to make sort of your video games look exceptionally sexy as you blew up sort of enemy commanders or whatever. Actually, these video chips, these chips are being used to drive sort of large language models and other versions of AI to train them, and they're becoming sort of vastly consequential in real battles rather than pretend battles. And that's something which I think sort of nobody would have predicted 15 years ago, that NVIDIA was going to become this massive economic engine. It had a very, very nice niche doing the things it did, and then suddenly technology changes. So trying to figure out how to deal with those with multi-use technologies is far, far more difficult, and going to be more difficult going forward.
Yeah, well, I think we're almost at time, and so let me wrap up with one final question to each of you, which is, sounds like there are a lot of rocks that you turned over in the course of your research, and I'm wondering if each of you has one burning question you weren't able to get to in the book that you hope to address in future research.
Well, I think I would just, I'm not sure that we're the best people to do this, but I think the point that Henry made, which is, I think there's another book to write, which is about the Global South and its role both in being the target of a lot of these weapons and also their responses. It's when you think about the Russia campaign, the sanctions regime, part of, I think, the limits of that campaign is how does the Global South receive it? And they're not the direct targets of it, but they're part of its implementation and whether it's successful. And I think that there is another research agenda to say, what could have the European Union and the United States done? They coordinated in such a remarkable way with each other. It was I think we talk about it in the book of like how it was an unprecedented campaign to coordinate these economic tools against Russia's invasion. But I think we didn't see that same level of coordination and effort with the Global South. And I think we're seeing the consequences of that when you see, Brazil or Turkey or a range of countries saying, hey, we're not on board with this. And so that's the book that I think really needs to be written, and I'm waiting for some eager graduate student or other faculty member to do it.
Yeah, no, we say that in the concluding part of the book, the conclusions which nobody is going to read, where we thank people, we say there is another shadow of this book that could have been written. We are talking about empire from the top because this is what we know. There's a book that could be written about empire from underneath, and we completely recognize that this is an important book to write. And it is also, I think, even more important than we realized when we were finishing up the book, because when we were finishing up the book, this was before I think people realized how frankly unpopular the US European approach to Ukraine was going to be for many countries in the rest of the world. And I think that really is a set of problems, a set of tensions that has really yet to emerge. And the other book that we could have, I won't say we could have written, somebody who is far, far more brilliant and broadly read than us could have written, would have been looking at the integration of the kinds of tools that we talk about, which are really the tools of coercion, with what Nick Mulder has called the positive economic weapon. In other words, the ways in which the United States and other powers have used and very often underused sort of inducements and attractions as well as coercive measures in order to try to get their way. This is a perpetual problem in the United States. It is very, very easy to get agreement that yes, we need more sanctions against country X. Getting people to spend money on sort of countries in other parts of the world, that is a whole different set of problems politically, even if sometimes it is much more likely to be politically effective. And the final thing, and I hope to God nobody ever has to write this book, is what happens if somebody like Donald Trump takes over these tools and techniques in 2024 or in 2028? What kind of world are we going to be in then? And that would not be a very, very nice world to think about.
Well, thank you both so much for joining us today. It's been a thought-provoking conversation, and to all the grad students listening, you have plenty of homework. Start writing those, I think, 4 book ideas. Please join us in thanking our guests, and thank you for everyone for tuning in virtually.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for a great conversation.
Thank you.